Hello and welcome to another session of The Change Exchange. My guest, Mandy Wiener, a fellow journalist, award-winning, if I may say that, author of 4 books, inveterate tweeter. I've just said she's one of my favorite tweeters, but then also mother and wife. We'll talk about all of that. Your first job was at 702. Did you want to do that, or did it just happen?
I'm sure you know that being a journalist is something that's inherent. You know, it's one of those things that's just in your blood. So I always knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I have a photograph of myself in a pram at 2 years old reading Newsweek. You know, I mean, to be honest, it's like watching you on carte blanche was probably one of the big motivating factors to becoming a journalist. And I thought that I wanted to be like that. I wanted to be like Christian Amanpour and go cover war zones. So I immediately went to go and study journalism at Rao. Which is now UJ. And
why did you choose Rao?
So, I mean, most people say, why didn't you go to Rhodes? But I came from a small town. I grew up in Polokwane. So I wanted to come to Joburg, and people had told me about the journalism course at Rao. So I suppose that's the reason I went, and then I started working at Rao Radio. And then the first job I got at 702 was actually writing traffic for Aki Anastasiou and for Harry Sideropoulos on the Rude Awakening. And I used to call screen overnights. So I would go in at 12 o'clock on a Friday night. I'd go out and then go into the studio and then answer the phone calls of people who were listening to the show, and the insomniacs and whoever else is awake at that hour. And that was the first job that I had.
The weird and the wonderful.
Exactly.
What's the best thing about radio?
Radio, there's such a craft to it. So my favorite thing about radio was telling stories through sound. And I loved spending hours busy choosing my sound bites and blending them together and choosing the right quotes and people, you know, the emotions that come through, that you can tell stories through people's voices. So often I would go out to a protest or a crime scene or something like that, and I'd try and find innovative ways to use sound to tell that story and make it come alive, because you can transport a listener to the scene of a shooting or of a protest, whereas if they're just reading the story, it can become quite one-dimensional. But when you actually hear the emotion of someone, you hear the gun going off, you hear tear gas canister or police tape flapping in the wind, all of that tells a story in a very unique way.
Your first story was actually quite mundane. It was, water cuts in Houghton?
Yeah, it started off mundane.
Yeah.
It started off mundane. It was the first story. I'd begged Katie Catapodis for a job in the EWN newsroom, and she sent me out to go and interview residents of Houghton about water cuts. And I was standing on the pavement, busy ringing a doorbell, and 2 guys pulled up and pulled a gun on me and held me up and started asking me for all of my possessions. But I was holding a microphone with a mic flag, and the one stopped suddenly and said to me, "Are you a reporter?" And I said, "Yes." And for some reason, I don't know why, but I'd hit record. So I was recording this whole exchange, and I said, "Yes, I'm a reporter," and he apologized to me, and he started giving me back all of my possessions, and it ended up on the front page of the Star, because I'd recorded the whole thing on John Robbie's show, and Katie gave me a job as a result of that.
You must have that must have confirmed everything you had thought the job might be.
Yes, I mean,
the
obviously,
adrenaline, all of that. Yeah.
Sure, I mean, we always have this idea that it's going to be glamorous, which it's not, and that it's going to be high adrenaline, which it often is, but there are also these moments of completely mundane, you know, boring periods of time where nothing happens. So there's a lot of waiting around. I mean, I've lost hours of my life waiting for press conferences to start and politicians to make decisions about anything. So it did confirm that, and you know, that having a front row seat to history and watching breaking news unfold, you know, is something that is addictive. I was saying to somebody recently that as a breaking news journalist, it felt like I was on crack, on news crack all the time, that I was constantly chasing the next breaking news story.
But that is, by definition, bite-sized.
Yes.
And daily. It's 24 hours, or, well, even shorter these days. What made you decide to write a really thorough, in-depth book at the age of 28?
So that was the problem, is that I felt like everything that I was doing was so shallow, and it was so transient, that we would do radio stories and then they would disappear into the ether. And you put so much work and effort into them and then they're gone. And I love books, so I've always thought that I wanted to write a book because I love the idea of a book. But I hadn't written anything more than a magazine article. And I went to my publishers, Terry Morris at Pan Macmillan, and I said, I want to write a book. And I mean, she was mad to give me a book deal on the back of one magazine article, but she did. And I don't think I realized at the time the gravity of what I was doing. I wrote Killing Kebble in about 3 months, and I never thought that it would have the reaction that it did. You know, it just never occurred to me that it would resonate with people in the way that it did.
You said that you knew you had a book when you had the interviews with the 3 murderers.
Yeah, definitely.
How did that come about?
I just asked, really. So I think that's the problem that journalists often make, is that they are too afraid to ask. And I just had this idea that I really wanted to interview them, and I built up a relationship with their lawyer and with them, and I wanted to tell their story. And I didn't think at the time, oh, what a big coup, I'm going to get these guys to talk and then it's going to be a fantastic book. I just wanted to hear their story. And I was very fortunate that they trusted me and that they told me the story.
Were they in jail at the time?
No.
So they were out on bail?
Yeah, they were out. Well, I mean, the thing about the Kebble killers is that they were given indemnity from prosecution. So they were able to stand up in a court of law and tell the world about this entire incident where the gun failed to go off and the car overheated and how Brett Kebble drove to his own death 3 times, and then they could go home to their families. So I would go see Markus Schulz at his house with his children around and go to restaurants and things like that because they weren't in jail.
And they were not going to be,
no.
And they knew that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, they literally got away with murder, and they know that.
How did you get them to talk to you?
So I think that
a young girl on the other side of the table.
So I think that it was my lack of judgment of them, and that I was willing to give them an opportunity to speak. So I think often what happens is journalists are quite quick to judge and to paint people with a certain brush. Whereas I really wanted to just hear from them and let them tell the story. And that's what I've always tried to do, regardless of who I'm interviewing, is to give them an opportunity to get their version across. And I've been criticized for that as well, because people argue that I give them a platform. But my view is I would rather hear their version and understand their world better so that we know what we're dealing with.
You do that for the audience, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that as a journalist, you always have to remember that you are a conduit.
Yes.
And that people are telling you stories. And I try not to make a judgment call or act as a filter in any way. I'd rather put all the versions out there as a conduit and let people decide for themselves what they believe.
The book must have changed your life completely. It sold more than 100,000. And this was, what, more than 10 years ago?
Yeah, so I mean, completely. I mean, it raised my profile, and it turned me into what some people have perhaps disparagingly referred to as a brand journalist, or a celebrity journalist, which you never quite know, like how to deal with that, right? Yeah. So where people recognize you or where they know your name, and I still find that quite awkward. Like I still find it quite strange when people walk into the room and say, "Are you Mandy Wiener?" Or they hear my name, because I'm not that. I'm just a journalist who wants to wear jeans and all-stars and run into crime scenes. Inherently, I think that's it. But it definitely changed, and it also makes a difference. If I phone somebody and ask them for an interview, you get more access because of reputation, because in this industry it's definitely your reputation that's everything.
The second book was Vusi Pikoli. Did that connection come through the research that you did for Killing Kebble?
Yeah, so it did, because he obviously was instrumental in the reason he was suspended, one of them was because of the Jackie Salibi case and because of his decision to grant immunity to the Kebble killers. And then I sat through his inquiry, the Jinwala inquiry into his fitness to hold office, and I got to know him. And then I just nagged him for ages to write a book, and he eventually relented. And it was quite different, you know, to write a book on your own about murder and crime, and then to do, you know, somebody else's book with them, which was kind of a more sincere book. It was his own journey. It was about what he calls his second initiation. So it was completely different. But it was an interesting experience for me to do that.
You got quite a bit of flack because it was seen as a whitewash, etc., etc. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, so I mean, the point that I always made was that it was him telling his version of events. And, you know, I still believe that I made a point of asking him questions in the book, and that's why he didn't write it himself. So I asked him about his decision to grant immunity to killers, and other decisions that he had made, and pushed him for answers on them. So, you know, I do think that, you know, that most of those answers did come out in the book.
And the response is the response, and it's not your responsibility, really.
Exactly, yeah.
And then why did you think that Oscar needed another book?
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure, actually. You know, there was so much pressure on us as journalists around the Oscar Pistorius story. You know, that 24, 48 hours after Oscar had shot Reeva were the most insane days I've ever experienced as a journalist. I mean, we were literally putting down phones and picking up phones, doing interviews with CNN and BBC and Sky and every radio station in Ireland and Canada and New Zealand who wanted some kind of local voice on it. It was insane. I mean, we always thought that the death of Nelson Mandela would be the big news story of that kind of era. And the coverage of Oscar was just phenomenal. And I suppose that's why I was asked to do the book in literally a week or two after it had happened, and it was an international deal. So we thought, yeah, like let's go with this. But it was tough because by the end of it, there was so much media coverage. It had been exhausted, and we tried to do the comprehensive book. So it's quite long, but it really is comprehensive about the book. So we try to interview as many of the role players and the characters and the experts as possible.
You say we?
I wrote it with Barry Bateman.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was also a unique experience because
Yes.
I'd never written properly, co-authored with anyone.
How does it work
In
in practice?
Yeah, in practice it's interesting, but he wrote and I wrote, but we both touched every single word of the book. So he would write chapters, I would write chapters, and then we'd both go over each other's chapters. And we also get on really well and complement each other. So so it was good. It was a learning experience. It was very novel.
But writing a book is a completely different way of being from
Yes.
the daily news. How do you switch? Which one do you prefer? How do you switch
It's completely
between them?
different. It's so I like to do both at the same time so that you can find different outlets. But writing a book is a very, very solitary experience, and people don't realize this. It is long hours, locked away in a room with yourself and a computer. It can be a very taxing experience on you, on your family, and also you reach a point where you just want it to end, you know, because also
Like being pregnant.
Yeah, exactly, exactly the same. It's a great analogy because you envisage the end product and you just need to get there. So and it's very laborious, you know. It takes very, very long, and you have to be so self-disciplined to actually sit down and get those words on a page every day. I mean, it's very well documented. The things that you find to procrastinate when you're on deadline are just unbelievable. You know, you read every article you can find about arbitrary stuff on the internet. So, yeah.
It's applying the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair.
Correct. Yes. Correct.
And of course that focus
Yeah.
that you have to do.
Yes. Yeah.
And now you've written Ministry of Culture, which is
Ministry of Crime.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm sorry. That was a bit of a Freudian slip. Now you've written a Ministry of Crime, which is a kind of follow-up almost on Killing Kebble. And it is, as you describe it yourself, the kind of the connection points between the criminal bosses, the politicians, and the police, the law enforcement agencies. And it can be quite bleak to, you know, you can walk away from that and think there's no hope.
Yeah, so what I've tried to do is look at the criminal underworld in the country over the last decade or so, but then also look at the evisceration of law enforcement agencies and this deliberate, malicious campaign to hollow out the NPA and SARS and the Hawks and NIA and all of that. And at the end of it, you know, I do want again, we're allowing it to happen on and on again. If we're not vigilant, then we'll see our law enforcement agencies being further eviscerated. And, you know, I want people to understand the importance of an active civil society. And
what does that mean in practical terms? What can people do?
So people often ask me that question. They're like, well, what difference am I going to make? And there are things that people can do. You know, they can tell journalists about what's going on if they know. They can give money to journalists like me, or to my colleagues at Amo Bungani, or, you know, something like that. But people can also, they can write to newspapers, they can phone radio stations, they can contact their local political representatives. If you have got a particular skill that you can offer to an NGO or a civil society organization, if you can give Freedom Under Law or KSAC or the Helen Sisman Foundation or Section 27 some kind of assistance. I have a friend who's an actuary who volunteered his time to assist Section 27 with the Life of Sedimeni case out of, you know, pure civic duty. And things like that are so important for people to do so that we can be active and be involved and hold power to account.
It's the basics of an open society, huh?
Very much so, yeah.
Every individual takes responsibility.
And I find that in South Africa we have often a culture of complacency. And we almost have this apathy, and we find ourselves quite, we're so inundated with bad news. There's so much about state capture and the Gupta leaks and about crime that many people want to just bury their heads in the ground like an ostrich and ignore that it goes on and listen to music in their cars, or just not watch the news because it's easier to do that. But you can't. You have to know what's going on. And that's why the media is so important, and supporting journalism is so important, so that we do hold power to account so that people know what's happening.
How has all this understanding and knowledge changed you, do you think? You're a small-town girl from a conservative Jewish background.
Yes. I think that I've always been quite worldly in a way. I mean, my parents always made sure I travelled a lot growing up. I read widely. So I think that even though I grew up in a fairly conservative environment, I always had a very liberal, progressive outlook on the world, which made for an interesting relationship with my parents, because I was always so, you know, pushing boundaries and trying to change their worldview as well. But I do think that having reported on this for so long, it definitely makes me more cynical. And when you're in journalism for a long time, you become a bit cynical and jaded. And, you know, I think that's why I don't do as much breaking news as I used to, because it became so repetitive that you become a bit disillusioned with it.
Villain of the week.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. And you try and get some perspective and tell important stories.
You've just joined News 24, and I think it's quite a coup for them. Is that
you
in the
tell
same?
Them that.
I will. Is that in the same vein that you want to shift to maybe longer form, or? I've
always loved long form, so I love really getting into a story and understanding it and all its complexities. You know, I love it when you can unpack something and really get to know it. And, you know, that's often a real indulgence for journalists. You know, a lot of our newsrooms are stretched, they're understaffed, you know, juniorization of newsrooms. And it's not often that we get the opportunity to do long form and to do more investigative work. So it's something that I would definitely like to look at. You know, podcasts for me are really an avenue that I've always wanted to explore, and I've done a bit of, because I still love radio so much. So, you know, I do hope to do a lot more of that and really get, you know, to do a deep dive into an issue rather than being parachuted in, and to cover it for one day is, you know, always something as a journalist that you want to do.
Yeah, we always joke that you become a one-week expert on everything, and then you
Become
walk
a
away.
one-day expert in everything, particularly in radio, where you just get thrown in and you have to be an expert in something different every day.
But News 24, like so many other news outlets, is really struggling to pay for itself, to monetize. How do you see this transition? And you joining that world now, can one build it to something that people are willing to pay for?
I think so. I mean, I think there's been a real shift in the news environment around the world, where newspapers are closing down everywhere. You know, there's this always the big debate in the media about what's in the public interest versus what's interesting to the public, and the way that people consume news and what they consume. So people are always more interested to read about the Kardashians than they are about, you know, the war in Syria. Unfortunately, that's just the way that the world works. And with people buying fewer newspapers and consuming news on their phones or devices, I think it's inevitable that it's going to go that way. I think it's just the way that the world is changing, and I think people need to also appreciate the work and the value of good journalism.
You are a very active tweeter. How do you see the role? You know, many people kind of poo-poo Twitter and say it's just a home of gossip and nonsense. My password is 10 seconde twak.
That's brilliant.
But how do
you
do
should change that now, because it's going to be... Yeah.
How do you see the role of something like Twitter?
So the role of Twitter 6-7 years ago is very different to what it is today. So when I first started tweeting, it was the first court case that had ever been live tweeted in the country, was the Jackie Salibi and Kebble cases. And it was this unique concept that we were sitting in there live tweeting, and it was so exciting and everyone was following us, and it became this amazing platform for people to consume news practically live. And we saw the Oscar Pistorius case, and it was huge, and you know, people were loving it and got hundreds of thousands of followers, and you know, became Twitterati, or whatever they call it. But in the last year or two, I think that Twitter's changed considerably. I think it's become a lot more toxic, it's become a lot more hostile. You have to be far more conscious and more careful about what you tweet. You know, it's become a platform for abuse. You know, to get dragged on the streets of Twitter is not such an uncommon occurrence, particularly for a journalist. So it has changed the way that I tweet. I mean, it's made me far less opinionated on Twitter. I try and tweet more factually, or links to articles that I write, because you just can't engage over constantly, and people hide behind avatars, and you know, often I've tweeted something that I think is fairly innocuous, and you don't realize that your worldview or your lived experience is different to somebody else's lived experience, and you may be offending them, or you may be saying something that gets you into a world of trouble. So I'm far more conscious about how I deal with Twitter now.
Are you a planner, or there's a door open, shall I, shan't I?
Ooh, a bit of both, you know. Like I'm definitely always well prepared and research thoroughly, and you know, always make sure that I know.
Yes, but career-wise,
but career-wise,
you want to be.
I suppose when the door opens, I walk through it, very much so. But I think you also make your own luck. So, you know, that's definitely been a mantra that I've lived by. You know, often I say, I'm so lucky, you know, the way things work out. But you make your own luck in life.
How did that manifest in your personal life? How did you meet Sean, your husband?
And he just persisted and wouldn't go away, really. You know, at the time when I met him, I was working so hard. I was chasing the next breaking news story, and I really had my foot on the pedal quite heavily, and I didn't really have time in my life for a relationship, and wasn't so interested in one, but we met through mutual friends, and as I say, he just persisted. I tried very hard to get rid of him, but I'm now very glad that I didn't.
So what made you decide in the end that this is worth it?
Oh, because a few years, you know, I just realized that he was the right person for me. And that was that, really. You know, it was he understood me, and you know, you know, a lot of people can be intimidated by what we do, and you know, people often say to me, "How does your husband feel about what you do and the security threats and dealing with all of these guys?" And I just say, "Have you seen him? Because he's very big, he's very muscular." So, but he also knew. I mean, it's on my packaging. He knew exactly what he was getting into.
And what makes it work?
I think mutual respect for one another. I think a common belief system is very important, that we were both raised in much the same way. I mean, he doesn't even read my books. So, you know, it's not like he's a journalist who's interested in what I'm interested in. You know, he always jokes that he only looks at books and reads them if they've got pictures and big writing. But I think if you've got the same belief system, it's very important for a marriage and to raise children.
You have 2 little ones, huh?
Yes.
How old are they now?
4 and 2.
Yeah. And how did they change your life?
Yeah, completely. So raising children is far harder than dealing with any politician or criminal. It's easily the hardest thing that I've ever done. But I think it forced me to slow down. It forced me to not place as much emphasis on my work. To not be as consumed or as invested in it. I'm consumed and invested in a different way now. So I think it's definitely given me more of a balance, if you can say that.
Did they force you to grow up in some way?
Yeah, definitely.
Take responsibility.
I mean, yeah, having kids is like it's proper adulting. You know, you've really got to. You're responsible for other living things, you know, little humans, and that's huge responsibility. So it definitely forces you to grow up.
You want them to be aware so that they can react in what way?
So that I want them to be non-judgmental, but I also want them to appreciate other people's lived experiences and other people's upbringing and experiences and their outlooks on life, and to not be as closeted as I was definitely growing up, you know, in apartheid South Africa in Petersburg. You know, so I want them to understand that, and you've got to do as much as you can as a parent to ensure that.
You've lived in Johannesburg since you came to university here. Do you want to stay? Or do you have a plan to semigrate at some point?
No. So I'm staying. You know, most of my family actually lives overseas, and I've chosen to stay here because I'm just incredibly patriotic and love this country. So you know, it's a tough time. I mean, a lot of people are undecided about the future of the country. A lot of people are considering what I like to call their plan Bs. But you know, our decision is we're here and this is home, and you know, I feel that as a journalist I've got an important role to play in uncovering stories and telling the truth and finding the truth and holding power to account. So and there's lots of stories to tell in South Africa.
Always. Yeah. Mandy, all of the very best with that, and good luck with your new phase in your career. I hope it goes fantastically well, also for the sake of News 24.
And filled with lots of good, juicy stories.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Until the next time, goodbye.